Have you ever tried applying common mixing advice you've heard repeatedly only to discover that it doesn't really improve your mix and sometimes even makes it sound worse? This happens because much of the information available online may be outdated or lacks important context. When techniques and mixing ideas become widespread, it's easy to lose sight of their original purpose. It's always important to 1. Question the intent of the information you're receiving, and 2. Actually test these ideas out for yourself to see if they can really help you in a practical sense. But this can take a considerable amount of time and research to do, which is why I've condensed some of the most common errors into this list of overrated mixing tips and advice. So by the end of this video, you'll know what tips work and, more importantly, what tips to avoid, including one that I see so many beginner mixing engineers make when they're first starting out. But before we start, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, I recommend checking out Sage Audio's mixing and mastering membership. As a member, I have to say the experience is incredible. Just for signing up, you receive 50 free mastered songs per year with your own dedicated mastering engineer, unlimited mixing feedback, and access to Sage Audio University for in-depth mixing and mastering courses, but more on that at the end of the video. The first overrated mixing tip is to use high-pass filters on every track in your mix. Now, high-pass filters can be great for cleaning up sounds and removing unwanted low-end rumble, but this often isn't needed on every single track within your mix. It's actually one of the biggest causes of a weak mix when overused. I think too many people get obsessed with the idea of separation and think that any amount of frequency overlap is instantly a bad thing. The overlapping of certain instruments and frequencies is a natural sound that the human ear is used to, and removing too much of this can leave you with an underwhelming sound and a mix that lacks any impact. This happens a lot when I see people splitting tracks apart too much or trying to fit them into certain boxes that they think they should fit within. When you think about a typical track, maybe something that is made up of drums, bass, guitars, and vocals, all of these elements should cover the main frequency ranges of a mix, and each instrument is there to serve a specific and intended purpose. When you run into frequency masking issues, the problem more often than not lies within the arrangement itself. A great arrangement will often need very little processing done to it to bring it to a professional standard, whereas a poor arrangement will leave you fighting to control too many tracks that ultimately aren't necessary. For example, I recently found myself mixing a song where I was sent an abundance of guitar and bass tracks that in the end just weren't needed to make the mix work, so I decided to strip things back and only use what I felt was needed. This helped to give the mix more clarity and didn't mean I had to add in a bunch of EQ and filters to try and make everything work together. Take a listen to the before and after and see if you agree with the less is more approach in this case. And to address the overuse of high-pass filters specifically, I've made a few A/B listening tests where, for example, A, I've added high-pass filters to fit certain instruments into the mix, and then for example B, I haven't added any high-pass filters at all. Some of these I feel help to clean up the mix, and others I think actually make things sound weaker by comparison. I want you to listen to each one and let me know what you think in the comments below. So here's the first example. And the second example. And the third example. Overrated mixing tip number 2 is to always mono bass. I think anytime someone prefaces advice with the word always is usually a bad sign. For this particular technique, the idea of making anything under a set frequency range mono, I'd say is very much a case-by-case basis as to when you should apply it. And there's a few factors you should first consider before doing this purely out of habit. One would be to think about where your track is going to be played. If you're making electronic music designed to be played in clubs through big PA systems, then mono in the low end definitely makes sense. The vast majority of club sound systems are mono, so it makes sense to get your mix to sound balanced in mono playback. If this is the intended environment most people will hear your song in. Another would be if you intended on having your music pressed on vinyl. This is a reason why artists will often have different masters made depending on the format, whether that's digital or vinyl. A digital master for a CD needs to be 16-bit in word length. It can be adjusted in volume and limited heavily based on a client's preference or concerns. In contrast, for a vinyl master, there's a physical limit to what the cutting head of a lathe can handle, so heavily clipped masters are discouraged and may require serious level reduction if they can be accommodated at all. For vinyl, the best source is a 24-bit file that's dynamic and likely limited or not limited at all. So in summation, while this tip isn't necessarily right or wrong, it's overrated in the sense that I think it's repeated verbatim without giving the context that is really needed first to understand whether or not you should use it. For example, a case where I feel like you don't need it would be if you're making something like lo-fi bedroom pop that's predominantly going to be heard through consumer-grade headphones and is only intended to be released on streaming services. You may find that keeping some of the low end of your track in stereo actually enhances things, particularly through headphones. Or you could even get the best of both worlds by splitting your bass track and keeping the subs in mono, whilst widening the upper range to make things more audible on smaller speakers. You can do this by using an imager plugin like I've done here, that will only target the upper range of the bass frequencies and spread these out whilst keeping the sub range narrow or completely mono. This way, you're able to get a wide bass sound that spreads out slightly to both speakers whilst keeping the very lows down the centre of the mix. Overrated mixing tip number 3 is achieving a balanced mix. Now this itself isn't a bad thing, but I've definitely known people who take this tip too literally. In fact, I was asked to give some mixing feedback to a fellow engineer recently, whose mix I felt sounded very static. I shared this detail with them, only to discover that they were doing it intentionally, measuring each section to make sure it was matching the same volume the entire way through. That to me just highlights how easy it is to take some pretty simple advice the wrong way. At least for me, I like when a mix shifts dynamically as a track progresses. The most boring mixes to listen to are the ones that just stay at one static volume throughout. If you want your mix to sound exciting and alive, then building shifting dynamics into a song, both through the arrangement and mix, is the key to achieving this. Of course, you don't want to take things too far where a listener is actively having to turn up or down the volume throughout a song, but having the perceived volume change throughout a track is really going to level up your mix in a big way. You can do many things in a mix to enhance the perceived volume of a track. One key technique is the use of strategic automation throughout a session. It has the power to transform your flat, uninspired mixes into something that really pops and grabs attention right from the start. People often overlook automation, seeing it as just a tool for tweaking volumes here and there, but the fact that you have the ability to automate pretty much anything in your DAW, from plugin parameters to faders to pan knobs, is a real game changer. Once you grasp this concept and start using it properly, your mixes will improve dramatically. Take for example this section of my mix. I'm going to play one example that has no automation in and one that does. See if you can guess what's being automated first before I reveal the results after. So here I was actually automating a few things, like riding the fader up during the drum fill along with the room mics, filtering the acoustic guitar at the start, and using some volume automation to enhance this transition effect. Now you know this, take one more listen to this section and focus on how these subtle moves help to enhance everything you're hearing. Don't be afraid to alter your plugin states throughout a mix too. Much like with volume, you don't have to keep each setting on your effect static either. In fact, one of my favourite features in plugins like this one is that they give you 4 states to cycle through, indicated by this A, B, C, D section at the top of the plugin. So you could in theory come up with a total of 4 different EQ states for different tracks or buses using the same sound sources, and automate these changes at different points in your mix. I found this to be a nice creative way of adding some movement to a mix when I receive a multi-track from a client that doesn't have a great deal of variation to it. Overrated mixing tip number 4 is to solely cut frequencies. In any mix, you'll have tracks that need either fixing, enhancing, or both. If you only cut frequencies, your mix may end up sounding dull or lacking impact. I get the point that some people are trying to make when they say this, but they wouldn't make EQs with a boost option if it wasn't something every engineer uses. Some sound sources will just naturally sound very dark, and although you can brighten things up by cutting frequencies, it's often going to make more sense to enhance the frequency range that needs it the most, rather than finding some workaround based on an arbitrary rule. Consider the example of a kick drum. This instrument often needs a combination of cuts and boosts to stand out in a dense mix. If you've ever mixed an unprocessed kick, I'm sure you're fully aware of this. Let's compare how this kick sounds in a full mix solely using cuts, and then one with boosts and cuts applied after. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, I encourage you to check out Sage Audio's mixing and mastering membership. As a member, I have to say the experience is incredible. Just for signing up, you receive 50 free mastered songs per year with your own dedicated mastering engineer, unlimited mixing feedback, and access to Sage Audio University mixing and mastering courses, which include start-to-finish walkthrough sessions for various genres and 35 multi-track sessions for hands-on practice. This platform is supported by their thriving community and tight-knit network of audio engineers. Every day, I see and hear great wins in the membership from both new and seasoned engineers, noticing a huge improvement in their mixers and masters after joining. Right now, you can join the Sage Audio membership with a 70% discount using the link in the description. So join today and start creating mixes that sound like professional songs.